If there's one thing I want you to remember from this video, it's that the way you relate to others and set boundaries as an adult is directly connected to your experience with your primary caregivers while growing up. Your moms, your dads, your grandparents, your uncles, aunts, whoever raised you majorly shaped how you relate to the world as an adult. This is important because that means unless you wake up to those dynamics, you'll be living them out in an unconscious way with your churches. It doesn't mean that you are powerless to change, but it does mean that as a pastor and a church planter, it is important for you to explore how your experiences while growing up and the way your family either had or didn't have boundaries is impacting your work and ministry. The goal with relationships and boundaries is a little bit like the Three Little Bears beds. You don't want them too soft like Mama's Bear's bed. You don't want them too solid and hard like Papa Bear's bed. You want them just right, with a combination of hard and soft like Baby Bear. So in boundary language, we don't want too weak or too rigid of boundaries. Now, my grandmother wasn't really great with boundaries when it came to my brother and I. I mean, to be fair, grandmothers aren't really supposed to be good at saying no to their grandchildren. And for those of you who are parents, don't you just love remembering things your parents let you do, like that you'd never let your own kids do? The thing for me was the fact that my parents let me have a BB gun. I remember this one time that my parents took a very rare weekend away, and so my grandma was watching us. So my parents were out of town, and I found myself in the backyard with my BB gun, and I began to wonder, what would happen if I shot the BB at the window? And not just any window, my parents' bedroom window. Why I chose this window, I'll never know. But it's pretty funny that that's where my little mind went. Obviously, the part of my brain that helps me think through cause and effect must not have been fully formed yet, because you'd think I would have thought, worst case scenario, I shatter a window, and that's not worth it. But I was a curious kid, and so I decided to point the BB gun at the window, and I pulled the trigger. And nothing happened. The window didn't shatter. I thought to myself, that's interesting. I assumed it must have bounced off, and so I proceeded to take the gun and shoot all of the windows on the second story of the house. And I eventually got bored and moved on to something else, and honestly, I didn't think another thing about it until my parents got home, and they called me into their bedroom, and as I walked in, my dad knelt down, put his hand into the carpet, and pulled out a BB. Do you know what this is, Candace? My dad asked. I won't bore you with the details of my punishment. And I'm sure you can imagine the rest of the story, right? Obviously, this video isn't a talk on why children shouldn't be running around with a BB gun. But it is true that our family history is the way we learn about the world. We are also all born with needs for love and safety and freedom, as well as physical needs of health and nutrition, right? Our experience of how these needs were met or missed are held in our bodies in a cellular way, even though we might not be aware of them. And that impacts how we live and engage in relationships as adults. So one of the first ways we learn about boundaries happens way before any of us are even aware of it. It happens at a very natural place, in our separation from those around us. If you're a parent, you might remember when your kids were really little and you take them to the park. They would run away from your arms towards a swing or seesaw or something like that, and then all of a sudden, they'd stop and quickly look back. They did this to make sure you were still there, to make sure they were safe. You did this with your parents too, in lots of different ways. You needed to know you were safe, but also free to go. When this process of closeness, security, and separation gets hijacked for any reason, it impacts how we think about boundaries as adults. Oftentimes, either we err on the side of too weak or too rigid boundaries. Examples of too weak boundaries can look like difficulty saying no because you're afraid of rejection, or Identity and feelings about yourself are dependent upon what others think of you. You take on others' problems as your own, or it can be as simple as ignoring your inner voice. An example of too rigid boundaries could look like you avoid intimacy by staying too busy, or you pick fights with those who want to be close to you. Or you rarely ask for help or let others impact you. So, what's the goal? Ultimately, we want interdependence, which means you need and want the other person, but aren't destroyed without them. You're okay on your own, but even better when the other person is a part of things. That you might say, but I'm a pastor, I'm called to love like Christ, which is an unconditional love. And that's true. But I challenge you that you can indeed have unconditional love while having a conditional way of engaging in a relationship. So, for example, you could say, I love you unconditionally, and I need to take care of myself by not meeting for worship practice tonight. You taking care of yourself is also a way you can help guide your congregation to take care of themselves. I want to remind you that we are all human, and so if all this talk is starting to activate anxiety in you, I want you to take a deep breath. It's okay to do this imperfectly. Every single one of us does. It's not about doing relationships and boundaries perfectly. It's about trying our best to be aware so that we can slowly move towards health more and more. If you don't know where to start, you can simply start by reflecting on your growing up experiences. It can be really helpful to meet with a licensed therapist and let them know you want to explore your family of origin and how it's impacted the way you live now as an adult, and how this is impacting your ministry, really. You can also ask yourself things like, was it okay for me to have my own identity separate from my parents or caregivers? Did I have to be the parent or the one to my parents? Were there times in my growing up where my basic needs for food, safety, and shelter were not met? These are the kinds of questions you can begin to self-reflect on. The last thing I want to say is that there are really wonderful parts of how you are with your church that are also connected to your growing up, that give so much beauty and goodness to those who encounter you. There is a both and to this. So let's dive in and see what's there.